Velkommen til webinar om sikker håndtering av bitumen. Litt forsinket, men forhåpentligvis så skal alt fungere helt perfekt fra nå av. Vi er i studio i NHO-bygget, og vi som er på skjermen nå, det er Ola, og så er det, jeg heter Arne, og de som sørger for at alt virker, det er Eline og Tage. Jeg jobber i EBA, i Entreprenørforeningen Bygg og Anlegg, og jeg jobber med vei og jernbane, avdelingsleder for vei og jernbane. Og det webinaret som jeg nå har så vidt startet, det er et tiltak som blir arrangert som en del av handlingsplanen til EBAs HMS-utvalg vei. Det vi skal få i dag, det er en faglig gjennomgang, en presentasjon fra en representant fra Eurobitume. Den presentasjonen den vil foregå på engelsk. Men bildene, de er på norsk. De er forståelige på norsk.
Ikke sant?
Og webinaret det vil bli tatt opp, sånn at det vil bli mulig å se det om igjen. Underveis så vil det bli mulig å stille spørsmål, og de spørsmålene de tar vi opp, og så vi skal se de i chatten, og vi skal ta de opp på slutten, og sørge for at Ian som skal presentere skal få de spørsmålene. Da tror jeg bare overlater ordet til og videre introduksjon til deg, Ola.
Takk, Arne. Before we move into English, kort presentasjon av meg også. Ola Mossblad, Operations Manager i Nynas. Vi er Bitumen leverandør. Jeg sitter med i EBAs HMS-utvalg for vei. Videre er jeg også med som medlem i Eurobitume sin Safety Committee. Og det er vel en av årsakene til at vi har lykkes å få samlet dette webinaret i dag. Arne og jeg, vi skal prøve å geleide dere gjennom denne lille timen her. Og som han sa, anledning å stille spørsmål på chatten, og som vi tar opp etterpå. Webinaret handler jo da om sikker håndtering av bitumen, og det skal da Ian Lancaster snart snakke om her, vår presentatør. Eurobitume er jo en konstellasjon som jobber med tekniske spørsmål, de jobber med sikkerhet, de jobber med bærekraft og utnyttelse av bitumen til vei, industri og andre applikasjoner innenfor byggeindustrien inne i Europa. And now I'm glad to introduce to you Dr. Ian Lancaster, our guest speaker of today's webinar, Safe Handling of Bitumen. Dr. Lancaster is Eurobitume's technical lead and member of Eurobitume Safe Handling of Bitumen Committee. I wish you welcome, and the floor is yours, Ian.
Thank you for the invitation. Today we're going to talk about safe handling of bitumen, and we're really going to cover three areas. The first is probably the most important, and that involves understanding the difference between hazard and risk and how hazard and risk fit together. Then we're going to look at the key hazards that we might come across when handling bitumen. And then finally, we will look at the effective use of personal protective equipment, or PPE. So let's have a look at hazard and risk. Well, hazard is any situation that can potentially cause harm. So if you look at the picture on the side of your screen there, the shark is the hazard. The next thing we need to consider is the exposure. And here we can look at the swimmer. So if the shark is in the ocean and the swimmer is on the shore, then the exposure to the hazard is effectively zero, and then the risk becomes very low or effectively zero. If the swimmer is in the water and a mile away from the shark or a kilometer away from the shark, then the risk of exposure becomes higher, and so consequently the risk becomes higher. And if we're in a situation, as you can see in the picture there, the shark is within 6 meters of the swimmer, then the exposure factor is very high, and as a consequence the risk of harm becomes high. And it's important to consider this when we look at hazard and risk, because the two are intrinsically linked, but the risk is the probability that an adverse effect or an adverse event will occur, so an accident or an incident. So the risk is a function of both the hazard and the risk. And when we talk about safe handling, we can focus on two particular areas. We can focus on reducing the hazard, or we can focus on reducing the exposure. And in an ideal world, we look at reducing both the hazard and the exposure. Now, there are some circumstances in which we can't do that, so we have to focus on one or the other, and usually it's focusing on the exposure. And that's really what I'm going to talk about or focus on most today. Let's have a look at the hazards that are associated with bitumen, and I'm going to cover 5 today. These are the 5 perhaps most important ones. The first is elevated temperature. Now I'm guessing, and I can't see everyone that's on this call, but I'm guessing that pretty much everyone in this webinar has an understanding that bitumen is normally handled and used at elevated temperature. And by elevated temperature, I mean we're operating at temperatures, let's say in excess of 120 degrees up to 190 degrees for paving grade bitumens, up to say 220 degrees for oxidized and industrial bitumens. So elevated temperature is the first hazard that we're going to look at today. And then we're going to look at contact with water. You might think that that's a strange thing to consider, because most people will say that that bitumen and water should not mix. They should never come into contact with each other. And that is absolutely true. But it is unfortunate that in some circumstances, if we're not careful, then bitumen can come into contact with water, and that creates a quite significant risk if it's uncontrolled. The next area we'll look at is hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide, commonly abbreviated to H2S, is a gas, a toxic gas, which is associated with not just bitumen. It's found in many petroleum products, but it has the potential to cause harm. And then we'll also look at fire and what we need to do if there is a fire, and high pressure. So let's look at temperature. That's our key hazard. And it's absolutely true that it is the main hazard which is associated from handling of bitumen. As I said in the previous slide, bitumen is stored and transported from 180 to 220 degrees. We need to have a lot of bitumen at those temperatures so that we can move it around, so that we can transfer it from a storage tank at a depot or a refinery into a bitumen delivery tanker, and then move it from that bitumen delivery tanker into a tank at the asphalt mixing plant, and then move the bitumen from the asphalt storage tank to the mixing plant. And then our applications range pretty much between 140 and 230 degrees Celsius, depending on the grade of bitumen that we are using. There has been a lot of focus on temperature reduction and implementation of what we call warm mix technologies. But really, our main focus on reducing the risk associated with handling bitumen at elevated temperature is done by reducing and avoiding exposure. And that means following safe handling guidelines and safe methods and safe systems of work when loading and unloading and storing the bitumen. That's our first level of control, the procedural aspect. In practical terms, if we're involved in the loading or unloading operation associated with a bitumen tanker, then we need to make sure that we operate a 6-meter exclusion zone around that operation. And that means we prevent anyone coming into contact with the bitumen that shouldn't be there. And then we need to make sure that we avoid contact with the skin and eyes by working in line with a risk assessment and including the wearing of personal protective equipment. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we can reduce temperatures in some circumstances. And we within Eurobitume would always recommend that bitumen is handled and stored and applied at the lowest temperature practical associated with its efficient use. So let's have a look at personal protective equipment. I cannot stress this enough. We need to ensure when handling bitumen that we do not allow any skin or eye exposure. What does that mean? Well, as you can see in the picture, if we start at the top, a safety helmet, preferably fitted with a chin strap. Why a chin strap? Sometimes we operate in conditions where there are high winds. A high wind can remove a safety helmet. If a chin strap is there, it holds the helmet in place. A full face visor to protect the face. Safety glasses worn underneath the visor as an additional level of protection. A neck apron. Sometimes we have incidents where a delivery flex or a delivery pipe bursts. Deliveries tend to be made under pressure. This can cause a spray of bitumen to go up in the air. It's important that the back of the head is also protected, and a neck apron will do that. Heat-resistant gloves worn with long sleeves. Protect the hands, protect the arms. A full fire-retardant cotton coverall with high visibility markings. It's important that it's cotton and not synthetic material. Coverall would go over the boots as well to make sure that there's no opportunity for bitumen to get inside the boot. And finally, safety boots that can be removed easily. What we've done there is we've reduced the risk by reducing the potential for exposure to the skin and to the eyes. And it's really, really important that we both maintain the personal protective equipment and replace it on a regular basis, but also that we're never tempted to cut a corner or to not use the personal protective equipment because of the atmospheric conditions, say. And here's an example. This is a real helmet from a delivery driver. He was making the delivery. There was a spillage. The bitumen came over and covered the visor. This was in southern Europe. The driver was delivering bitumen. In the temperatures at the site were around about 35 degrees. But he said, I was hot, but I lowered my visor, and that saved him. If the visor had been up, he would have suffered serious burns. So please don't ever be tempted to not use the personal protective equipment. It's there for a reason, and it's only effective when it's used properly. If, however, you are unfortunate enough to suffer from a bitumen burn, we within Eurobitume have produced a bitumen burns card, which is the document that you can see in red. Important things to consider. The first thing is to cool the burn immediately. Get it underwater for at least 20 minutes. And we don't want to use freezing cold or ice cold water. Cool running water for 20 minutes. That will minimize the effect of the burn. Secondly, never be tempted to remove the bitumen from the surface of the skin because it has the potential to cause further damage. Being burnt is bad enough. Trying to remove the bitumen from a burn will only make the situation worse. So don't be tempted to do it. Please leave the bitumen in place. If the bitumen is surrounding a limb, then there is the danger of what we call a tourniquet effect. If there is a situation where that occurs, we would recommend applying a small amount of paraffin or vegetable oil somewhere on the on that bitumen to allow it to soften, and that will take away the tourniquet effect. And then finally, do not attempt to remove it. Attach the burns card to the person that's been injured and send them off to hospital. On the back of that burns card is advice for medical professionals, which we have obtained via working with burns specialists across Europe. What about contact with water? The reason we need to be very careful about contact with water is if we have water within a tank and it comes into contact with hot bitumen, the water expands at a rate of 1,600 to 2,000 times, depending on the bitumen temperature. So a very small amount of water in a storage tank or a delivery tank can be enough to cause the generation of a large amount of steam, which can be enough to cause the bitumen to come out of the tank itself and spill over the sides. It's important to understand where we can find water. We can get water in cold tanks that have not been used for a period of time. Condensation can build up inside those tanks and it can collect at the bottom. Also, we can get water ingress via open manlids. If there's a manlid at the top of the tank and it's left open, then rain can get in and can collect at the bottom of a tank which is not in use. And we can also get a situation where an incompatible load has been in a delivery tanker beforehand. So that would be, for example, if a tanker had been used to deliver bitumen emulsion and then was used to deliver hot bitumen, we need to ensure that a delivery tanker which is used to collect and distribute bitumen is fit for purpose and it doesn't have any water present. And that's what the matrix on the side of this document is showing you. It shows you the compatibility between different grades of bitumen, different types of bitumen, and this is available on download from the Eurobitume website. Right at the very top, it talks about making sure that water isn't present in a delivery tanker. I'd said that bitumen coming into contact with water will cause the water to expand and form steam at a rate of 1,600 to 2,000 times. And under normal circumstances, that foam will rise and it will escape through vent pipes and overflows. However, if the tank is not well maintained, if the vent pipes are blocked, if the overflows are blocked, then what happens is we get a buildup of pressure. And bitumen tanks are not designed to be pressure vessels. They're not there to contain pressure. And as a consequence, we can get an explosion taking place within a bitumen tank if foam pressure builds up or steam pressure builds up. So I can't stress enough the importance of maintenance on storage tanks, as well as making sure that tanks are free from water. We need to make sure that vent pipes and overflow pipes are well maintained so that there is no buildup of pressure. I now want to show you just a little video which explains what can happen when bitumen comes into contact with water. This is a real situation. This is not dramatized. And I want to draw your attention to some things. So this vehicle had come to take a delivery of bitumen. This is the driver. He'd started to load. He'd gone through all of the pre-delivery checks, if you like, and hopefully you can see that this is unusual. This loading is unusual. There's a lot of fume or smoke or steam or something happening here. Well, now let me show you what happened. Can you see? This is bitumen boiling over at the top. You can see it coming out of the bottom here. And there it comes out over the edge of the delivery. I'm going to show that again because watch where the driver goes. You see where he runs away because the bitumen's coming out. And just where he's run past, a few seconds later, hot bitumen comes out. Had he been a few seconds later running away and taking that escape route, he would have been very badly burnt. So what happened here? Yes, pre-delivery checks were, or pre-loading checks were carried out. The depot was informed that the previous load was bitumen and loading commenced. What had actually happened was the vehicle had contained bitumen emulsion previously. It was the first load of the season coming in to take hot bitumen. There was a layer of bitumen on top of residual emulsion. Once the bitumen that was being loaded started to melt through that layer of bitumen on top of the emulsion, it came into contact with water. the water formed steam. Steam caused an increase in volume, and as you can see, a lot of bitumen came out of that delivery tanker, caused significant damage to the loading system, and it was very, very close to being a serious personal injury. So be very careful with water. Check, check, and check again is the message. Hydrogen sulfide. You may be familiar with hydrogen sulfide from elementary chemistry. You may remember that you've been told that hydrogen sulfide has the smell or the odor of bad eggs, and this is true. It does have a smell of bad eggs at low concentration, but at higher concentrations it is odorless and it's tasteless, so you can't pick it up simply by the sense of smell. Why do we need to be concerned about hydrogen sulfide? Well, because it's a highly toxic, colorless, corrosive and flammable gas, and it is heavier than air. So based on the fact that it is odorless and tasteless at high concentration, you must never ever rely on your sense of smell to indicate whether or not hydrogen sulfide is present. So always carry out testing prior to entering into a tank for maintenance to make sure that hydrogen sulfide is not there. You must also consider and follow our safe handling guidelines published by Eurobitume. Consider signage, and also review use of PPE. If hydrogen sulfide is known to be present in high concentrations, then you need to be thinking about the appropriate use of personal protective equipment to mitigate that, but also introduce detection equipment, personal alarms, personal dose monitors, etc. Where will we most typically find hydrogen sulfide? Well, we tend to find it mostly in the headspace of the tanks. So around about here, we will get it. Now, bearing in mind or considering that our bitumen storage tanks are open to the atmosphere, it is understandable that hydrogen sulfide can expose can be released through the breather vent and also through the overflow vent as well. Why is this important? Because whenever we introduce and say a new delivery to a bitumen tank, the volume of bitumen goes up and the hydrogen sulfide, which is present in the headspace of the tank, can be expelled by the breather vent or via the overflow vent. So wherever there is the potential for exposure to hydrogen sulfide, we need to consider our risk assessments. We need to consider the use of appropriate signage. The next area I want to cover is fire. Where can we get a fire? Well, a fire can start actually inside a storage tank. This tends to happen most commonly if the bitumen heating system is not completely covered with bitumen. So the tank level has reduced, the heating system becomes exposed to air. High temperatures around the elements of the heating system can be enough to cause a fire. fires can also start in the insulation of a storage tank. It's actually more common for it to start within the insulation of a storage tank. The reason this happens is because as the storage tanks breathe, they release sort of oily matter which can condense and become trapped inside the insulation. If a source of ignition is presented to the insulation, then we can get a fire in the insulation. Then we have some less common causes, clearing a blocked pipework using a live flame. There's a possibility of fire starting there if the naked flame comes into contact with either the fume or the bitumen itself, and also using solvents and oils to clean bitumens, and then using a live flame. The causes behind that, behind the fire, could be operating storage conditions above the flash point of the bitumen. For example, storing a cutback or a fluxed bitumen at too high a temperature and a temperature above its flash point. If we store above the flash point, then we run the risk of that material spontaneously catching fire. So it's important to understand what our storage temperatures should be, and thinking about what I said before about storing and handling the bitumen at the lowest practical temperature associated with efficient use. So store at lower temperatures, it's in your interest to do it. We can get flammable emissions from cutback bitumens and fluxed bitumens where we've introduced either solvents or oils, and they can also catch fire. We can also get a buildup of what we call pyrophoric sulfide. Now, these are compounds caused or formed by the reaction of hydrogen sulfide with the steel or iron construction of the storage tank itself, and they form what we call pyrophoric iron sulfides, and these are deposits that can spontaneously catch fire. We can reduce the risk of those pyrophoric sulfides forming by having a proper maintenance and cleaning regime for our storage tanks. And finally, I've spoken about contaminated insulation coming into contact with oxygen and a source of ignition. Then we can get a fire in the insulation itself. What should we do if a fire occurs? My advice to you all is not to try and tackle it yourself. Evacuate the area, call out the emergency services, leave it to the professionals. They're more experienced to dealing with these sorts of incidents than we are. But we can minimize the impact. So shut down the tank heating systems. Make sure that other tanks are isolated. That really prevents the fire spreading. If it's a small fire, for example, if it's taken place in a laboratory, only feel that you should tackle it if you're trained and competent. If not, again, sound the fire alarm, evacuate the area, call out the professionals. If you're trained and competent to do so, then you can tackle a fire using carbon dioxide or foam or a fire blanket. Never ever use water because that will simply amplify the fire. If the fire has occurred, and let's say that it is it's happened in a bitumen storage tank, then carry out a full investigation. Why did it happen? Investigate all the possible causes and leave nothing to chance. If it's found that the fire has started in the insulation of a storage tank, then it's important to remove and replace all of the insulation. Don't be tempted to just replace part of the insulation, because if there's contamination in one part of the insulation, it's likely there's contamination in another. And I can use an example here. Many years ago, my company supplied oxidized bitumen to a company, and they had a very poorly maintained square storage tank. And they called me one day to say that they'd had a tank fire, and would I go down and help them with the investigation and give them some advice, which I did. And I made the recommendation that they cleaned the storage tank and replaced the insulation. And about 6 months later, I had a call from them to say that they'd had another fire, and could I go down and help them with the investigation. And I did. And remembering that this was a square tank, and I asked where the fire had started, and they said it started in the insulation. We know that. And I said to them, but I had advised you to change the insulation, replace the insulation. And they said, yes, we did, in the areas that were affected by the last fire. And when I questioned where the fire started, it was on the one section where they hadn't replaced the insulation. So always replace the insulation in all parts of the tank if you have a fire in the insulation. It makes much more sense to do so. And finally, we're going to deal with the pressure hazard. We have to understand that bitumen tanks are not pressure vessels. So we need to make sure that we manage the risk caused by pressure buildup really through effective maintenance, so that we don't allow pressure to build up in a bitumen tank. We can get builds-up of pressure in delivery hoses or in delivery lines where blockages have occurred. And we can minimize the chances of pipe blockages, again, through proper preventive maintenance, effective use of trace heating systems, effective lagging of delivery lines. And we also need to be aware of pressure buildup during the process of connection and disconnection from tanks. Which kind of brings me towards the end of what I wanted to talk about today with regarding safe handling of bitumen. What I wanted to do was really introduce and make sure that we understand the hazards associated with bitumen. And once we understand the hazards, know how we can manage the risks that are associated. And risk management procedures start with safe working procedures. They start with safe working procedures, safe systems of work, minimize temperature, and effective use of personal protective equipment. Now, obviously, I have covered a lot of information on the hazards, but I want everyone to take away from this the fact that bitumen is a safe product when it is handled correctly. You know, we've put a lot of effort into making sure that bitumen's handled correctly and therefore doesn't present a risk. Where to go for more information? Well, go along to the Eurobitume website, eurobitume.eu. There is there's a huge amount of information there on safe handling, safe delivery. There are a range of toolbox talks, sort of short introductions, which are available to download. You can go to the Energy Institute, where you can find a high-level document, the Bitumen Safety Code, which is currently being revised, and we expect it to be published, that revised document to be published hopefully within the next month. And I guess that's it from me. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to talk more.
Thank you very much, Ian. Tack. Very good. Yeah, there's been some questions arised here, Ian, and I'll take a few of those because I see we have some minutes left.
Okay.
And one of those is, I will read here. What do you believe is the greatest challenges regarding upcoming years towards safe handling of bitumen and minimizing accidents to happen? Do you have any experience there? What do you believe?
What's the main challenge? I think the main challenge really is probably overcoming historical practices. I'll use the example from our experience within the UK. We faced a situation where we were having regular uncontrolled spills of bitumen at delivery sites. And we acknowledged that we needed to do something about it, and we worked with the end customers to solve this problem. In let's say 2010, 2012, suffering about 80 uncontrolled spills every year, and we've now got that down to single figures. In 2022 we only had 4. 2021 I think we had 3, but we only managed to do that by working together. So the biggest I think the biggest challenge really is getting that cooperation together to identify that there is an issue, and then working together to tackle it. There are that we face, but those are secondary. I think it's the understanding and the adoption of that common way of working, I think, is the challenge.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question or advice from you. It's still winter in Norway, but we're getting close to starting up a new season. What do you think, or what is the most important steps, your recommendation for the asphalt entrepreneurs to do before the season starts to limit the amount or the risk of accidents?
Very simply, check everything. Don't assume that the plant is there as you left it before you got into the winter season. Make sure everything is operating as it should. Tank gauges, temperature gauges, alarms, pumps, tanks that have been unused, make sure they're checked for water. Just check, check, and check again. And when it comes to starting the plant back up, do it slowly.
Precisely.
Don't go from zero to full operation. And invest in training. Invest in training as well. People forget.
Thank you. There's been about 80 participators here today, and a question raised is if it's okay with you and Eurobitume to share this PowerPoint presentation. Then the organizer will do that. Okay, I see you're nodding. Very good.
I will check, but I think so.
Yeah. A few words before we say thank you to you, Ian, in Norwegian.
Okay.
Då kan man ju gärna ta kontakt med Eurobitume som det är så, eller också Arne Åkre i EBA, eller mig i Nynas om man har någon spörsmål, om man tränger någon material eller sånt, så vi är till tjänste. So I think we would like to thank Ian for the presentation, and this is the result from the Norwegian jury. 12 points goes to United Kingdom. Thank you very much, Ian. Have a nice day, all of you out there, and take care and beware.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.